Well, good morning. Glad you could join us again this week online. And best news of all, we're hoping this is the last week online. Our plan is that starting next week, that's June the 20th, every Sunday morning going forward, we're going to have a service at the church. And so if it's good weather, bring your lawn chair, a bottle of water, umbrella, whatever it is you need to enjoy the service. Starting at 10 o'clock on Sunday mornings. We hope to be done by about 11 to sort of beat as much of the heat as we can. But what a great opportunity for us to gather together without all of the restrictions, and be thankful for that. Remember, you need to just keep those 2 meters, 6 feet apart, and you can take off your masks while you're in your little group of people in your household. And so we're thankful for the opening up of a lot of these things. If it's rotten weather, please come anyway, and we'll just be doing a drive-in service. So you stay in your car, roll the windows down, and we'll do the same service we were going to do as before, just we'll do it with you in your car in the parking lot. So either way you look at it, services every Sunday morning all summer long. Looking forward to that. Good to see that. Please just also remember a couple of people. Karen Earls and Doug Fortune, both recovering from surgery these days, and just ask that God would grant them healing, first of all, freedom from pain, but also give them patience and peace in the midst while they wait. And for doctors as they choose to treat them and how they go forward from here. We're thankful that we have a church that prays for people, that cares for each other. And so please keep that up and be praying for them in the days that are ahead. Good to have you with us. Welcome to church.
Was my cross you bore, so I could live in the freedom you died for. Now my life is yours, and I will sing of your goodness forevermore. Worthy is your name, Jesus. You deserve the praise. Worthy is your name. Worthy is your name, Jesus. You deserve the praise. Worthy is your name. My shame is gone. I stand amazed in your love undeniable. Be exalted now in the heavens as your glory fills this place. You alone deserve our praise. You're the name above all names. Be exalted now in the heavens as your glory fills this place. You alone deserve our praise. You're the name above all names. Be exalted now in the heavens as your glory fills this place. You alone deserve our praise. You're the name above all names. Be exalted now in the heavens as your glory fills this place. You alone deserve our praise. You're the name above all names. Be exalted now in the heavens as your glory fills this place. You alone deserve our praise. You're the name above all names. Be exalted now in the heavens as your glory fills this place. You alone deserve our praise. You're the name above all Jesus, you deserve the praise. Worthy is your name. Worthy is your name. Jesus, you deserve the praise. Worthy is your name. Worthy is your name. Jesus, you deserve the praise. Worthy is your name. Worthy is your name. Jesus, you deserve the praise. Worthy is your name.
All right, well, grab your Bibles and we're going to look at all of chapter 27, second last chapter in the book of Acts. This is our, I think, 34th message in the series, so it's taken us a while to work through it, but I hope it's been an encouragement to you, and I hope it's been a challenge to you. Challenge to your heart, and today I think is going to be another one of those challenging thoughts and thought-provoking times together. So let's just take a look at sort of where we're at, and here's a map I'm just going to pop up on the screen for you, and this is what we're going to look at today. We're going to start in Caesarea, where Paul was in prison last week, and so remember, he's gone and he's talked to the tribune, he's talked to the governor, Felix, Festus, and now he's even talked to King Agrippa. All haven't found anything that is worthy of death, but Paul has appealed to Caesar. He's kept in Caesarea for a significant period of time, and now this map shows you the track that we're going to look at today. So chapter 27 covers all of the space, all of the travel between that green circle you see there in Caesarea, all the way over to the red circle you see in Malta. And Malta is that little island that is just south of the big island of Sicily, just below Italy. So that's sort of where we're at. So we have this long journey that Paul's going to be on. It's all going to be on ship, and it's going to be a challenging one. So as we look at that, we're going to see some important thoughts that I think we need to apply to our lives today. So there's sort of the geography we're going to cover in our talk today, but more importantly, let's look at the story and the theology that we cover as well in our own lives. So let's read Acts 27 together. And then once we've read it, we'll look at some of the applications that I think come out of this really pivotal chapter in the life of the Apostle Paul.
Acts chapter 27. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria, sailing for Italy, and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days, and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go farther, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. Coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was a city of Lycia. Since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo in the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. Now when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon, a tempestuous wind, called the northeaster, struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo, and on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island. When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they all were encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship, and when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Now when it was day, They did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then, hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land.
So as we read that chapter together, I hope you caught the big ideas, the big thoughts that are there. And I just want to share with you a couple of the things that sort of stuck out to me. And today's message is not going to be a long one, I don't think, but I think it's going to be an important one. It's going to be an important one that I think should challenge us. And so let's just sort of look at a few of the big points, the broad points that I hope will challenge the way you think and the way you act. So the first point I want to bring to you is this one thought, that God never promised smooth sailing. Remember, God had made a promise to Paul that he would make it all the way to Rome, that the things that he'd been able to say in Jerusalem and Caesarea, he was going to be able to say to the emperor in Rome. So that's where Paul is going to head. So God promised that he would make it to Rome. In the interim between when Paul is given that promise and it actually happens, lots of tough times happen. And this voyage that they're about to embark on is going to be an example of how things aren't always easy, even though the promise of God making it okay in the end remains intact. So, verse 1 of chapter 27 says to us, when they decided they should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. So now Julius is going to be the guy who's going to be in charge of the prisoners and those that are going to Rome, and it's his responsibility to get them there safely. So now he's in charge. He's going to be the decision maker, and Paul is going to be put on this boat when they decide it is time. The boat is going to be filled with a bunch of different people. There's going to be some other prisoners probably that are also going to be headed to Rome. There's going to be some soldiers that will be on there. There'll be provisions that are coming from the Middle East area there in Israel and in Lebanon and places around that. And they're going to be headed back to Rome as well, partly to provide for the sake of the soldiers and also to take back to Rome itself. So as Paul gets on the boat, I want us to see this one thing. The promise of God is there that he is going to make it safely to Rome. But the process of getting to Rome was not easy. That's why I said God never promised smooth sailing. If you look at these verses I put up on the screen there for you, just look at them this way. Look at the way the voyage, the trip is described. In verse 7 it says they arrived with difficulty at one spot. In verse 8 it says, and they coasted along one of the shores with difficulty. And then in verse 9 it says, and the voyage, because of the time of year, and it was now in smack dab in the middle of storm season, was now dangerous. So difficulty, dangerous. They're now going to face, verse 14, tempestuous winds. In verse 15, it says they were driven along. In other words, where they wanted to go, they could not go. They were going where the storm and the winds were driving them. And then finally, in verse 18, violently storm-tossed is the way that Luke describes the trip. And it's pretty obvious that Luke is on the boat with Paul, and Luke is an eyewitness to all that's going on. And so in all of these things, with the promise of God still intact that he was going to make it all the way to Rome, we need to see that the voyage was not an easy one. So with that thought in mind, and with all of these examples of what it means to trust in the promise of God, in the midst of difficult times, we need to understand this one truth, that God never promised a follower of Jesus a pain-free, conflict-free, challenge-free life. There's this whole idea in our culture today that if we become a follower of Jesus, and probably to some degree we are our own worst enemy, because we believe absolutely that when we trust in Jesus as our Savior, the biggest problem that we have, our sinfulness, goes away, and it does. Unquestionably it does. Washed away. God removes our iniquity and our sinfulness and our shame and our guilt and our punishment from us. And we need to hold on to that thought. But at the same time, we perhaps have also given people the indication that from this point on, life is going to be wonderful and rosy. And that is not true. In fact, we need to understand, we need to come to grips with, we need to embrace this idea that following Jesus is not going to be easy. So here's my takeaway on it. Don't be disappointed when life is hard. Just because we're followers of Jesus does not mean we will not endure all of the same challenges that everybody else on planet Earth has. In fact, it may get even harder for us because we're followers of Jesus. But in those moments where life is hard, let the world see the difference in us that Jesus makes. So, understand this, that while the promise of heaven and forgiveness and an eternity with God is promised to us, the journey there will not necessarily be easy. I have a couple of verses for you just to consider and to think about. In Luke chapter 9, verses 23 and 24, we see some words of Jesus, and he's talking to his disciples. And so let me read them for you. And he said to all of them, to any one of them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. The whole idea there is the one that the Gospels are founded in. The whole idea there is the idea of what our study in Acts is all about. It's to give our lives away for the sake of the gospel. That's what Jesus was saying. If you give away your life for my sake, you will find it. You'll keep it. You will hold on to it. But before he says those words, he says this, that every day you and I need to take up our cross. To take up the instrument of putting our selfish desires to death and follow Jesus. It's not following the easy path. Jesus said that there's a wide path and a narrow path, and the narrow path, the one that leads to heaven, is not an easy one, and it is not easily found, and it is not easily walked. And so we need to understand that just because we're followers of Jesus, we don't get a free pass on suffering. We don't get a free pass on difficulties. We don't get a free pass on calamity. We get the same things that everybody else does. The difference is we have hope for what lies beyond this blip of time that we call our lives on earth. And whoever gives up his life for the sake of the gospel will find it. That's what Jesus says. Look at John chapter 15. He's talked about how without him in our lives we can do nothing of significance for God. And then he branches out into this whole idea of how we're going to be treated by the world. So if you think that the process of being a follower of Jesus is going to be an easy one, just look at what Jesus has to say about being his follower. If the world hates you, this is chapter 15 of John, starting at verse 18. If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of this world, but I chose you out of this world, therefore the world hates you. Not dislikes you, hates you. Verse 20, remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they would also keep yours. But in all these things, they will do to you, but all these things they will do to you on account of my name, because they did not know who sent me. Wow. So there you go. Jesus said it. The promise is true. Trust in him. We have a full life and we have the hope of heaven. We have hope of forgiveness of sins. We have the hope of eternity with God. But in the meantime, life will not necessarily be easy. And so God never promises us smooth sailing. As we look at the next little portion, or the next thought or idea that I want us to sort of grapple with as we consider some of the verses in this, is this whole idea of resetting priorities. So as I mentioned, the trip was not easy. What's happened is they've let the voyage go a little late in the year, and it talks about being past the time of the fast, which is probably an allusion to the Day of Atonement. Is the holy day. It comes at sort of the end of the summer, beginning of fall, sort of what we would call September, October-ish, that time of year, and the storms have come. And so because of that, because of the time of year in the storm season, the voyage was hard. And the winds were against them, and they were being pushed in ways that they didn't want to be. And so they were going to endure that. As a result of these storms that have now picked up, we see what has happened is that they now have to figure out what's most important. So look at what happens in verse 18. Because of the strength of the wind and because of the storm overtaking them, in verse 18 it says this: since they were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. So here's the first sort of thing that gets lost in the priority scheme. It's the extra stuff. It's the stuff that they don't need to necessarily deliver there, but it's the things that are the extras on board. And they may have been gifts for people. It might have been extra food. It might have been extra rations. It might have been some things that they didn't really need but would have been nice to take. That stuff gets chucked overboard. And then it doesn't take too much longer until the next day they realize it's not enough. And then in verse 19 it says that they started to throw the tackle overboard. That's the things that were necessary for the boat to function the very best way possible, but they were extra things. They could have been extra pieces of equipment. They could have been anchors. They could have been all kinds of things that were there. And so they were lightening the load as much as possible. Now, why would I look at those things and suggest we need to draw an application from it? Because I think the guys on the boat were making priority reset decisions. They were thinking when they left the harbor at the beginning, well, these would have been good things to take along. These would be nice things to have. They'd be important to have and good things to have. But when it really gets hard, when it really gets tough, when it really starts to become real as far as peril is concerned, all of a sudden priorities reset. And all of a sudden the only thing that matters is their lives. And all of the things that they thought they needed, all of a sudden they recognize they really didn't need as much as they had first thought. So here's what I was sort of pondering and thinking about when I looked at those verses. Probably in the last year or so, we've had to reset some priorities and maybe really valuable, profitable priority resets have been made. Because Because ultimately we realized that while we would like to do lots of things, we realized at the same moment that they weren't necessary. They weren't as necessary as perhaps we first thought. So here's what I want you to do. What are the priorities that you have recalibrated in your own life in the last year? So take a moment and just sort of think of that. What are the things in my life that given the situation in the last year, what are the things that I've realized are not really as important or as highly required as perhaps I thought they were a year or two ago? Because we have this odd way of mixing up what we need and what we want. And so there's probably been something in your life, a pattern, a habit, an activity, a decision, a choice, a wish, a hope that you realize wasn't as important as I thought it was. And I hope that in these days that you've recognized that the people that are closest to you, the family members and the best friends that you have, are the things that are most valuable. And the stuff that you do and the things that you have and the places you go pale in comparison to that. And I hope that perhaps you have recognized that in this past year, your relationship with the God who loves you so much is much more important than it was before. That your reliance on God has been increased in the past year. I hope so. Let me just ask you this question too, because the book of Acts is all about fulfilling the Great Commission. Remember, Jesus said, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every nation, to every creature, and then teach them and to baptize them and to make disciples of me. That's what Jesus told us to do, and that is the Great Commission in a nutshell, and that's the purpose of the church. So let me ask you this even harder question, perhaps. If we are to advance the Great Commission, what do we still need to change? What is it that we still need to do some work on? What is it in our lives and in our church? Is it that we need to recognize as secondary in order to achieve the primary, which is reaching our world with the good news of Jesus? What is it that we need to peel away so that we free up resources, people, and finances to go and to reach people with the good news, with the gospel? What is it that we need to reset? What is it in your life, in my life, that we need to reset in order to accomplish what God has for His people in these days? And then, I love this part. In verse 21, Paul just sort of can't resist this one moment. This is sort of the transition point to the next thought I want to share with you. But look at verse 21 of chapter 27. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, and why were they without food? Probably because they were busy scrambling for their lives. But perhaps they were even trying to please their gods, their deities, by abstaining from food. But look at what Paul says. And I love what he says. Men, you should have listened from me and not set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Paul just can't resist the moment to say, I told you so. I told you so. He said, I'm telling you, we're heading out the wrong time of year. We should stay where we are, hang in, and people that were probably going to gain from it financially decided they were willing to risk what they were going to do and do these things. And Paul says, I told you so. I told you so. So that leads me to my next point, which is really a reiteration of my first point. God never promised smooth sailing, but I added this part to this point, just a safe landing. See, as hard and as difficult and as tempestuous as their journey was, and as hard and difficult and tempestuous as our lives can sometimes be, here is the truth that we hold on to. That our future is certain. The book of Hebrews talks about it as being an anchor for our soul. The hope that we have, the faith that we have, means that heaven is assured, that the safe landing is always there, and life is going to be hard and difficult and challenging, but the hope of eternity is set. And so with those things in mind, we'll look on and see these last little bits, these encouraging thoughts, and I want you to be encouraged by them. First of all, let's look at the promise of God, starting at that same verse 21 and going down to verse 26. Since they've been without food a long time, Paul stood up and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet, now I urge you to take heart in the midst of the storm, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship." And that's a nice thing to say, but Paul, where are you getting that from? Verse 23. "For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and who I worship. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul, for you must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you.'" What's the translation of that, Paul? It doesn't look good maybe right now. In this moment, it's not looking great for the ship. It's not looking great for the possibility of you getting there safely. But Paul, you are going to get to Caesar. You are going to get to Rome. And Paul, here's another bonus. God's going to take care of every single person on this boat. It's not just going to be you and a couple of guys are going to make it. Everyone that you see here, they're all going to survive. So, look at verse 25. "So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told." And I wish he didn't have to say this bit. But then he says this, "But we must run aground on some island." So guys, here's the promise. It's going to be, we're sure we're all going to make it. But I just want you to know, when we hit ground somewhere, because we're going to, it's all going to be good. And that's what happens. So the promise of God, even in the midst of the storm, even with a bad thing going to happen, the promise remains. Then look at verse 33 and 34. So here he just says, just trust God. Trust God and the God that I serve and the God that I love. Therefore, let me just start halfway down verse 33. "Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense without food, having taken nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength." And here's that encouragement again. "For not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And Paul says, so God is going to take good care of us. So trust him. Don't work so hard at doing what you can do and trusting what God has promised to do. There's a good encouragement there. And don't get all worked up, because God's promise is going to come to pass. Last thought here that we see is in verse 35. And it says this, "And when he said these things, he took bread. He broke it. He took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat." Here's Paul, and he's not doing communion, so don't think that's what's happening here. But what Paul is doing, he's actually giving an example, a real life example of what they should be doing in trusting in the God that he's trusting 100% in. And in the midst of the storm, Paul thanks God that he can trust in him. He can trust his life with God. The last sort of big thought I want to share out of this chapter are the last few verses. And this whole idea of God never promised smooth sailing, he has promised a safe landing. It comes to pass. And so what I want you to do is see in these verses man's plans, God's plans. I want you to see the difference between what man is proposing and what God imposes instead. "Now when it was day, they did not recognize the land." Look at verse 39. "But they noticed a bay with a beach on it. of which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they're thinking, okay, here's my plan. I don't know where this is, but it looks like a beach. I think we can do this. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea. So they had anchors dragging behind them to slow them down. That was the idea of them. So they cast off the anchors, left them in the sea, at the time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. So basically they're ready to go into this spot where they think is going to be good. And hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. Verse 41, but in this situation, that's not a good word, because it's going to be different than their plan. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. And at which time, I think Paul's probably saying the same thing in his mind that he said before. I told you so. We're going to run aground. Guys, I told you so. And so here it is, man's plan, we're gonna get safe. We're gonna go into this nice sandy beach. God's plan, no, this is gonna get ripped up. I told you you're gonna run aground. You're gonna smash this boat to pieces. And God's plan happens, not man's plan. But let's keep going, because here's another one of man's plans, God's plans. So now they're in trouble. They're stuck against the rocks, and the bow is stuck, and the wind is pushing at the stern. So basically it's just getting wedged in between the rocks. The boat is going nowhere. The soldiers' plan was to kill, look at this, to kill the prisoners. Now what had God said? Everyone's going to live, right? The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest anyone should swim away and escape, and they'd be in trouble if they let prisoners escape. They would sacrifice their lives in light of letting those get away. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. So God even superintends in the mind of the centurion. He orders those who could swim to jump overboard first and make it for land. And look at verse 34. And the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship, so it was that all were brought safely to land. See, man's plan, I'm going to save my own skin. God's plan, I'm going to save everyone. Big difference. The plan of man and the plan of God. I think that safety and certainty in the plan of God is what we hold on to. It's the hope that we have, but here's let me share with you a thought that I think should motivate us. See, that we can go through life living it for us, keeping our lives, like Jesus said. If we hold on to our lives, let me live for me, let me live for the now, let me live for my satisfaction, my pleasure, my objectives, let me live for me. We could do that, save our own skin, so to speak. But God's plan is bigger than that. He said, go into all the world and preach the gospel. You're going to be my witnesses to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost part of the world. See, we're called to take on the Great Commission as followers of Jesus. We're not called to live for ourselves anymore. But he who loses his life for my sake, for the sake of the gospel, will find it. See, the book of Acts is all about people that were willing to give up their lives for the sake of the gospel. And quite honestly, we don't have people in churches today that are willing to give up their lives for the sake of the gospel nearly as much as we need. We can live for ourselves or we can live for others, because God's plan was to go and to reach everybody. God's not willing that any should perish. His plan would be that his people, his church, go and they reach everyone, so they all get safely to shore. Here's the hard reality. Here's the thought I want to leave with us today. that the time may be short. It may be really short. We can think of that from an end times perspective, but we can also think of it as it from a life perspective. That our opportunity to do what God wants of us might be very, very short. Because Jesus may call us home or he may return. But in either case, I think time is short, and it might be very short. So here's the point that people need to hear about Jesus today. It's your and my responsibility to reshape our priorities, to reset our priorities for our lives so that they focus more on others than it does on us, and to hold on tight to the promises of God, remembering that even when it's hard, God's promise of a certain ending, of a hope of eternity with him still stands, and it always will. So when it gets hard, and it probably will get hard, hold on firm to the promises of God that we have because we've placed our faith in Jesus, our Savior. Let me pray and we're done. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for the reminder again today that you care for us. And even when we're going through the storms of life, whatever they may be, we can trust in your promises that our citizenship and our home is not here. It is in heaven. God, help us to live in light of that and to literally give our lives away for the sake of the gospel. Point us to people this week that we can share the hope that we have with, because we know that you love all people. God, help us to go this week and make Jesus famous. We ask it in his name. Amen.